Ringside docs are there to make sure the fighters are as safe as can be in a sport full of terrible combat, but tonight at UFC Freedom, it certainly appeared as if Marc Goddard just may have completely ignored the recommendation of the referee to call off the Ilia Topuria fight early. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Suter, and the goal on the channel is to teach more about the medical side of the sports world. So I want to dive into what happened here tonight with Ilia and Topuria at UFC Freedom, because
The doctor's head shook in a slow, definitive no as he examined the wreckage of a champion's face. Ilia Topuria was standing there with a right eye that had essentially ceased to function, a victim of a relentless assault that left his vision completely dark and his future in the sport hanging by a thread. But instead of the fight ending right then and there to save a man's eyesight, referee Marc Goddard did the unthinkable and brushed the medical expert aside. It was a moment that sent a chill through the entire arena because it signaled that the safety net for these fighters had been completely shredded for the sake of the show. What followed was a sequence of events so dangerous that it has effectively forced a functional ban on Topuria as he deals with the aftermath of a night that should have been stopped.
honestly felt like the doctor said the fight needs to stop, and then Marc Goddard essentially came in and said, no, not so fast. This whole sequence started after the third round. Topuria got absolutely peppered, multiple shots to the right eye, and we could hear the translation while Topuria was on his stool, with his team calling for the doctor, saying that he could not see.
Here, the narrative.
We are looking at a situation where the fundamental rules of combat sports were tossed out the window, and the consequences are nothing short of devastating. Dr. Brian Suter, a leading voice in sports medicine, has analyzed the footage, and the verdict is absolutely terrifying for anyone who steps into that cage. Topuria wasn't just dealing with a bit of swelling or a minor cut that needed some Vaseline to get through the final round. He was suffering from what experts call catastrophic ocular trauma, a condition where the brain can no longer process visual input because the physical damage is too severe. This was the exact moment the UFC's medical protocol suffered its biggest failure in history, leaving a star fighter in a state of medical limbo that could end his career permanently.
The fight. We see the ringside physician come in, he does a quick part of his assessment, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, and then afterwards he basically looks over to Marc Goddard and shakes his head and says no. Based on that doctor's initial assessment, Topuria cannot see. He is not safe to continue.
The damage started piling up in the third round during a sequence that can only be described as a brutal, systematic dismantling of a human being. Justin Gaethje was landing shots that weren't just scoring points. They were vibrating through Topuria's skull and compromising the delicate structure of his orbital bone. Each punch that landed on that right eye was a nail in the coffin of his ability to defend himself against a world-class striker. By the time the round ended, the fighter was stumbling back to his stool in a state of sensory deprivation that should have triggered an immediate and permanent halt to the contest. Instead, the world watched as a blinded man was prepared for more punishment while the officials stood by and watched the clock tick down.
And the doctor tells Marc Goddard, no, he can't see. Fight should be off. Looks like this other gentleman who then steps in is one of the other ringside physicians that was there. Maybe this individual speaks Topuria's language better, but clearly there was some concern here from Topuria about thinking that he should be able to continue, despite telling his corner he couldn't see out of his right eye. Ultimately, of course,
The segment is the
While the crowd was roaring for more action, a terrifying conversation was happening in Topuria's corner that the cameras almost missed in the chaos. Through the translation of the frantic corner work, the truth finally emerged. Topuria explicitly told his team he could not see out of his right eye. In the world of professional fighting, those words are supposed to be an automatic stop for the bout. You cannot fight what you cannot track, and you certainly cannot protect yourself from world-class power when half of your world has gone pitch black. This admission changed everything, turning the fight from a competitive match into a life-threatening situation where the fighter's own warrior spirit was being used against his physical survival.
the globe or one of the muscles controlling the eye, something that can happen with an orbital fracture, but also just, are you simply able to see? Because if you're not able to see because of substantial swelling, you can't see, you can't protect yourself. If you can't protect yourself, the fight is going to be called. So it's not so much about is there damage to the eye, but also could there be enough swelling that they just aren't able to see? Because if the swelling is so severe that light can't pass through, it doesn't matter.
When a fighter admits they are blind in one eye, the ringside physician is supposed to be the ultimate authority whose word is law. Dr. Suter explains that the doctor isn't just looking for a heartbeat. He is conducting a high-stakes neurological exam right there in the heat of the moment. He was testing the 12 cranial nerves that control every micro movement of the human eye and the brain's ability to process light. This isn't a suggestion or a request for the fighter's opinion on whether they want to keep going. It is a scientific evaluation of whether or not that human being is physically capable of continuing without risking permanent, life-altering disability. The doctor knew exactly what he was seeing, and the alarm bells were ringing loudly.
What he's trying to assess here is not visual acuity. He's not looking for visual fields. He is trying to assess the cranial nerves that control the movements of the eye. There are 12 cranial nerves, the ones he is specifically trying to test here by going side to side.
Here,
The doctor performed the finger tracking test, a simple but vital movement designed to see if the brain and the eyes are still communicating under pressure. Topuria failed the test completely. His eyes remained fixed and unresponsive, unable to follow the doctor's hand as it moved across his field of vision in the dim light of the arena. Seeing this, the medical professional didn't hesitate. He looked directly at referee Mark Goddard and gave a clear, unambiguous head shake. The signal was unmistakable to everyone watching the broadcast. The fight is over, the fighter is compromised, and we need to get him out of there immediately. It was a medical directive that should have ended the night, but the referee had other plans for the main event.
Or there is light getting into the back of the eye, but the muscles are not firing because either the nerve's damaged, the muscles are damaged, or in the case of a combat sport, there could be a fracture to the orbital socket that's causing those muscles to get pinched and preventing them from being able to adequately move. So there are multiple pathways that you're evaluating by doing this finger tracking. You're seeing if
But then, the unthinkable happened in front of millions of viewers as Mark Goddard seemingly decided he knew better than the medical expert on the scene. Instead of waving the fight off and prioritizing Topuria's long-term health, Goddard essentially told the doctor to step aside so the violence could continue for the fans. He uttered the words that would eventually lead to this massive fallout, saying he was fine with the fight continuing despite the doctor's explicit warning. It was a staggering display of ego over safety, a moment where the referee became the most dangerous person in the entire octagon. By overriding the doctor, he stripped away the only protection the fighter had left, setting the stage for a truly catastrophic outcome.
a multitude of different reasons, but clearly here he is not able to track, says no, fight needs to be off. When he goes back and does this again, I think this is probably just somewhat like, okay, give me the answer that we all want to hear. It doesn't even look like he really moves his finger the second time through when Goddard goes back in, and I think Goddard was just stepping in to say, no, I think the fight should continue, but it clearly looked like a situation where he...
The segment delivers...
To understand why this was such a massive gamble, you have to look at the anatomy of an orbital fracture and what it does to the human face. Dr. Suter points out that when the bones around the eye break, they can actually pinch the muscles that control eye movement, locking the eye in place forever. If a fighter is forced to keep taking impact while those muscles are trapped, they aren't just risking a loss, they are risking the actual physical detachment of the retina or permanent nerve death. By allowing the fight to go on, Goddard wasn't just letting a fight happen. He was potentially presiding over the end of a young man's quality of life. The damage was no longer just about the sport, it was about whether Topuria would ever see clearly again.
Like that balance of you're there to keep the fighter safe, but yet the fighter is engaging in something that is inherently dangerous, where you know they're trying to essentially hurt each other, is a really difficult...
There is a very specific reason why vision is the one thing you can never compromise on in a cage full of elite killers like the ones in the UFC. If you have a broken hand or a torn ligament in your leg, you can still see the punch coming and try to move your head out of the way. But when you are blind on one side, you are essentially a sitting duck for a knockout blow that you won't even see until it's already landed. The damage Topuria had already sustained was catastrophic, but the damage he was about to receive because he couldn't see the incoming strikes was what truly concerned the medical community. It was a recipe for a disaster that was being allowed to happen in slow motion on live television. What makes this entire situation even more suspicious is the way the second check was conducted by the officials in the center of the cage. Dr. Suter noted that when Goddard went back in to supposedly verify the doctor's findings, it looked less like a medical exam and more like a performative act. Goddard barely moved his finger, giving Topuria an easy way to pretend he was tracking it just enough to stay in the fight and keep the show going. It felt like the officials were fishing for the answer they wanted to hear, rather than the truth that the fighter was in desperate medical need of a hospital bed. This performative safety check is exactly what has led to the current investigation and the functional ban on the fighter. This highlights a dark reality within the combat sports world, where the pressure of the spectacle can sometimes drown out the cries for basic safety. We are talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry that thrives on these epic, bloody battles, and stopping a main event early is the last thing any official wants to do. But when that desire for entertainment leads to a referee overriding a doctor's professional judgment, the entire system is fundamentally broken. The decision to keep Topuria in that cage was a betrayal of the trust every fighter puts into the officials to protect them from their own warrior spirit. It transformed the octagon from a regulated sports arena into something far more dangerous and unregulated. The fallout from this decision was immediate and has led to what many are calling a functional ban for Topuria as he deals with the medical aftermath. The catastrophic damage mentioned wasn't just hype for the cameras. It resulted in a medical situation so severe that he has been sidelined indefinitely while specialists try to save his career. This isn't just a standard rest period between fights that we see after every major event. This is a forced removal from competition because the damage sustained during those final minutes was entirely avoidable if the protocols had been followed by the man in charge. He is currently unable to clear for contact, leaving his belt and his future in a state of total uncertainty. We have to ask who really holds the power in the octagon when a human life and a career are on the line. Is the ringside physician just a prop used to make the sport look more legitimate, or are they a real safeguard against permanent injury? In this case, the doctor's authority was completely undermined, creating a dangerous precedent for every other fighter on the roster. If a doctor says no and a referee says yes, we are no longer watching a regulated sport. We are watching a sanctioned tragedy waiting to happen. The UFC's silence on this specific hierarchy of power is deafening, and it has left fighters wondering who is actually looking out for them when the lights are bright. The details emerging from the translated audio of that night make the situation even more gut-wrenching for fans who care about the athletes. You can hear the desperation in the corner as they realize their fighter is compromised, yet the machine keeps moving forward regardless of the risk. Topuria is a warrior who would never quit on his own, which is exactly why the referee is there to make the hard choice for him. Instead, he was sent back out into a hail of gunfire with one eye shut and a target on his head, all because the system failed to acknowledge the obvious medical reality. This failure didn't just affect one fight, it shook the confidence of the entire MMA community. The risk of permanent blindness is a heavy price to pay for 25 minutes of entertainment in a cage. Experts suggest that the type of ocular trauma Topuria faced can lead to glaucoma, cataracts, or a permanent loss of depth perception that would make high-level fighting impossible. By ignoring the doctor, Goddard didn't just extend a fight, he potentially shortened a legendary career by an entire decade. This is why the medical community is so outraged by what they saw on the tape, as it represents a total disregard for the long-term health of an elite athlete. The damage done in those final moments might never be fully repaired, regardless of how much money or fame was generated. Since the footage went viral, the public outcry has reached a fever pitch, demanding accountability for the officials involved in the scandal. Fans are questioning how a sport that claims to prioritize fighter safety can allow a blinded man to continue taking headshots from one of the hardest hitters in history. The controversy has sparked a massive internal review, as the implications of this failure are far-reaching for the organization. If this is how the top-tier officials handle a clear-cut medical emergency, what is happening in the smaller fights where the spotlight isn't as bright? The integrity of the sport is at stake, and the answers provided so far have been anything but satisfactory. Dr. Suter emphasizes that it doesn't even matter if there was an actual bone fracture at that exact moment. The massive swelling alone was enough to justify the stoppage. If the swelling is so severe that light cannot physically pass through to the back of the eye, the fighter is legally and functionally blind in that moment. There is no middle ground or gray area here. You cannot defend yourself against a professional fighter if you are missing 50% of your visual field, yet Topuria was expected to do exactly that while the world watched in stunned silence. It was a medical impossibility being treated like a minor inconvenience, and the fighter is the one paying the ultimate price. Imagine being in that cage, hearing the roar of the crowd but only seeing half of your opponent as they move in for the kill. It is a death sentence in professional combat. Every time Topuria moved his head, he was guessing where the next strike was coming from, essentially playing a game of Russian roulette with his brain health. The fact that he survived the encounter is a testament to his toughness, but it should never have been a test he was forced to take. The officials are there to prevent toughness from becoming a life-threatening liability, but on this night, they did the exact opposite and encouraged the danger to escalate until it was too late. This incident has set a dangerous new standard that could haunt the UFC for years to come if it isn't addressed immediately. If a fighter loses their vision and a doctor says to stop, but the fight goes on anyway, where is the line? Does someone have to lose an eye on live television before the protocols are taken seriously by the referees? The functional ban on Topuria's return is a direct result of this negligence, as his body now has to heal from trauma that should have been mitigated hours earlier. It is a massive wake-up call for the entire industry that the spectacle has gone too far and the athletes are the ones being sacrificed for the sake of a viral moment. As it stands today, Topuria is facing a long and uncertain road back to the octagon, with many experts wondering if he will ever be the same fighter again. The catastrophic damage to his eye has left him in a medical limbo that feels like a lifetime ban from the sport he loves. While the UFC continues to promote its next big events, the shadow of that night hangs over the featherweight division like a dark cloud. We are left watching a champion sit on the sidelines, not because he was defeated by an opponent in a fair fight, but because he was failed by the very people paid to protect him. His absence is a constant reminder of the day the system broke. The ethical dilemma here is profound and touches the very heart of why we watch and regulate combat sports. We know these athletes are going in there to hurt each other, but there is supposed to be a thin line between a sport and a crime. That line is the presence of rigorous medical oversight. When that oversight is ignored by a referee, the sport loses its legitimacy and becomes something much darker and more predatory. Dr. Suter's breakdown has opened the eyes of many fans to the fact that what we saw wasn't just a tough fight. It was a breach of the moral contract that keeps the UFC running. The price of that breach is a fighter's health. There are now whispers of a massive investigation into the conduct of the officiating team that worked that night. The implications are clear. If the referee is found to have deliberately ignored a medical directive, the legal and professional consequences could be historic for the sport. This isn't just about one fight or one fighter anymore. It's about the future of how every single MMA bout is regulated across the globe. The ban on Topuria might be the headline today, but the real story is the potential dismantling of the current officiating system to ensure this never happens again. We are at a crossroads where safety must finally take precedence over the show. At the end of the day, Ilia Topuria's career hangs in the balance because of a few seconds of stubbornness in the heat of battle. We have to decide as fans and as a community what we value more, the thrill of a fight that goes the distance, or the life and health of the warriors who provide that entertainment. This catastrophic failure of protocol has exposed a rot in the system that can no longer be ignored by the powers that be. If we want this sport to survive and thrive, the word of the doctor must become the final word, or we risk losing more stars to injuries that should have never happened in the first place.